Hello everyone and welcome to game 10 of the Airthings Masters preliminaries. It's basically the second game of the third day. Magnus Carlsen versus Hikaru Nakamura, the two of the biggest rivals in modern chess, and it's always interesting when the two of them have a nice clash. So let's see what happened in this one, as it's a very exciting game. So Magnus opens with e4, of course, with the white pieces. We have e5 by Nakamura, knight to f3, knight to c6, and bishop to b5. So the Ruy Lopez is on the board, and whenever we see this in top tier games nowadays, it's basically always the Berlin defense. So knight to f6, we have castles by Magnus, and now knight captures on e4. Something we see very often, the Rio Gambit. We have rook to e1 attacking the knight, and knight to d6 now, attacking the bishop, but not really. Here just knight captures on e5, and of course you cannot trade, because if you capture the bishop, just knight captures on c6 check wins the game, since you will lose the queen whatever you play here. So instead we have bishop to e7. This is all very standard stuff, and now the bishop really is under attack, so bishop back to f1, and now knight captures on e5, rook captures, and now Nakamura castles, and d4. So the rook is excellently placed here on e5, and of course you want to kick it away from here. Carlsen already had this position against Wesley So this year in the Skilling Open. The game ended in a draw. Wesley attacked the rook with bishop to f6, but here Nakamura goes for knight to e8 first. He wants to advance the pawn to d5, and he'll kick away the rook from e5 later on. So rook back to e1. Magnus knows that the rook will be attacked, so best to move it right away. And now d5. We have bishop to f4 by Magnus, and now bishop to d6. So a very nice, sort of a timid opening choice, trading most of the pieces and not really exposing anything to danger. So queen f3, and now bishop captures on f4. And it's very interesting. This position has been reached before, but the game ended in a draw. It was actually reached in Croatian team championship between Darko Felitar and Mladen Palac. It was a sort of a team championship, and there probably was a draw agreed on all boards, so the game ended in a draw here. But of course the two of them did not agree to a draw, and Magnus just recaptures. Queen captures on f4, and it is as of move 13 that we have a completely new game. And Hikaru immediately goes queen to d6. The knight nicely defends it from there, so you don't have to ruin your pawn structure if Magnus trades. And here Magnus gave it some thought. He was like, do I trade queens, do I not? And in the end he played queen to f3. He decided he's not going to trade queens, and he wants to try and do at least something with the white pieces, not just draw after 2 minutes. So knight to f6, preparing bishop to g4, and Magnus allows it. Just knight to d2. He doesn't feel it's necessary to prevent the bishop from being developed. Bishop to g4, and now Magnus does play queen to g3. Queen to b3 might also be an option, but here Magnus decides to trade. So queen captures, we have h captures, and now rook f to e8. Hikaru further offers to trade pieces. We have f3 by Magnus, kicking the bishop back, bishop to d7, and now g4. Always useful when you have doubled pawns. Just push one pawn all the way, and good things will happen. So here h6, not allowing to be further pushed with the g5, and now king to f2, improving the position of the king, and Hikaru trades now. Rook captures, and now rook to e8. Hikaru offers another trade of rooks, but Magnus, again, not interested in an early draw, plays rook to c1. He wants to play c4 and to try and get another line opened up for his rook. So c6, and now we have a4 by Magnus. We have rook to e7 and a5, so really advancing that pawn on the queen side. And now comes knight to e8. The knight can now come to d6 or c7 if needed, and now knight to b3. Magnus is also preparing to shift the knight over to c5. So knight to d6, the knight will be more active here, also keeping a better eye on that c4 square, and knight to c5. Magnus now attacks the b7 pawn as well as the bishop here. So bishop back to c8, guarding the pawn, and now b3, not allowing the knight to jump into the c4 square, and also preparing c4 in the future. So g6 by Hikaru, and now the immediate c4. So challenging that the d5 pawn. Hikaru trades. We have captures, and now king to g7, and it's a pretty equalish position. Magnus's pieces are a bit more active. The a5 pawn is very nicely placed, but nothing too serious. The situation on the clock, however, 15 plus something seconds, 15 minutes plus some seconds for Magnus, so he actually has more time than when the game started, and in Hikaru around 10 minutes. So here, bishop to d3 by Magnus, and now f5. Of course, Hikaru wants to lower the material on the board. G captures on f5, we have bishop captures, and now again, Magnus declines the, further trade of pieces by going bishop back to e2. And now the bishop on f5 isn't really doing all that much. It was there only to be traded, so now the bishop will probably have to move so the knight can come to f5. We have h5 by Hikaru, and now knight to d3, asking Hikaru, do you want to trade bishop for knight? But if you trade bishop for knight with play on both sides of the board, maybe the bishop will be a bit stronger than the knight. So Hikaru doesn't like this, he goes back, bishop to c8. And now he frees up the f5 square for the knight. Situation on the clock, 13.5 minutes Magnus versus 8 minutes Hikaru. And here, knight to b4. Now you're ready to push maybe a6, maybe weaken the c6 pawn, and so on. So here, Hikaru goes knight to f5, puts pressure on the d4 pawn, and Magnus just pushes it, d5. And with this move, Magnus basically creates a passed pawn, because whether you trade, the passed pawn will be created, or you play c5, again, d5 will become a passed pawn. So here, Hikaru does go c5. He could also trade, like we said, it also creates a passed pawn, but it seems easier to take care of this pawn. Instead, Hikaru plays c5. Magnus goes back, knight to d3, and now rook to c7. He has to defend the c5 pawn, so rook to c7, and now knight to f4. Now, could be dangerous. You have to be careful. Knight to e6 check is lurking. For the moment, the bishop is guarding it, but you have to be careful. So here, also you cannot play g5, as knight captures on h5 would come with check. So here, first h4. This is how Hikaru prepares g5, and now bishop to d3. We have g5, the knight is nicely protected by the bishop, and also the knight is attacked. And now, while you can go knight to h5, Magnus just brings it back. Knight to e2, and now comes knight back to d6. And okay, Magnus goes knight to c3, and still trying to, wiggle around, trying to wait a mistake from Hikaru. And also, it's very unusual, especially for Hikaru. I mean, imagine if you're Hikaru, you are Hikaru, everyone, no one takes you lightly, and then you face Magnus, and he doesn't want to give you a draw. He wants to really play it out for the entire game and try and get a win out of it. So not a situation Hikaru finds himself in very often. And situation on the clock, 8 minutes Magnus, 5 minutes for Hikaru. So here, king f6. Of course, this is the best move. Hikaru improves the position of his king, and now rook to e1. At some point, knight to e4 is coming. Magnus wants to improve the pieces, his pieces as best as possible before this happens. So bishop to d7. A nice waiting move by Hikaru. Also, at some point, he's preparing to push this pawn to b5. And now Magnus goes for it. Knight e4 check, knight captures on e4, and now it seems like a good idea to go f captures on e4, because you have a nice pawn chain here, and if you can get e5 in with check, you're basically winning. However, after king e5, you're never getting e5 in. The bishop is now locked in, behind your light square pawns. So it would actually be black who's at least a little bit better here. So instead, after knight captures, we have bishop captures by Magnus, and then now comes b5 by Hikaru, trying to either get this, so he gets a pass pawn, or a captures on b6 en passant, and then the other pawn will capture, and then the other pawn will be pushed along the b file. So here, Magnus goes d6 first, as the bishop covers the light square, so the rook needs to move first, rook to c8, and now c captures on b5. Bishop captures on b5 by Hikaru, and now rook to b1. And now it's very interesting, what do you do here? The bishop is under attack. If the bishop moves, you allow Magnus to bring his rook all the way to b7. And here, Hikaru has the option of playing this very safe a6 move and completely lock off the rook from using the b file. However, after this rook to b1 move, Hikaru played bishop to c4. Maybe not a mistake in itself, but it allows Magnus so much activity, either by going d7 right away or by going rook to b7. Magnus goes for rook to b7. He attacks the a7 pawn here, and now Hikaru says, okay, you have that pawn, I'm gonna get rid of this pass pawn. So Magnus says, okay, I'm gonna capture this guy because now I get a passed a pawn, and Hikaru just captures on d6. And here Magnus immediately goes after the c5 pawn. So rook to d2 check. Hikaru tries to pull a little trick on Magnus here, because if Magnus isn't careful, if he plays an active move, then rook to e2 is checkmate. You kind of don't want this to happen. So after rook to d2 check, Magnus has to go back. He plays king to g1, and now Hikaru took a pretty big thing, like 2.5 minutes, which is a lot since he's very low on time, and he decided to go for bishop to d5. And bishop to d5 simply will not do. He should play something like g4. g4 seems like a possible move here. For example, after pawn captures, then you go back, you go after this pawn, and the game continues. However, here Hikaru played bishop to d5, but this is just a complete blunder, and it completely blunders the game away. So feel free to pause the video here and win this game for Magnus while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on spotting the rook to d7 move, just pin the attacked piece, and for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it's rook to d7. And now this bishop has nowhere to go. If you capture the bishop, then you lose the rook. If you do nothing, then you just lose a piece. So Hikaru played king to e6, attacks and defends, but Magnus just moves it back, rook to d8. You cannot defend because you lose the bishop. So here, Hikaru did the only thing he could. He started pushing his passed pawn, but Carlsen's passed pawn is much faster. So a6, c3, and then now comes, rook captures on d5, but there's really anything you play here is perfectly fine, because even if bishop captures on d5, it's still just game over. This comes with check. For example, after king f5, you're going to play a7, and after c2, you can just put the rook behind the passed pawn. Even with this check, for example, king h2 or f2, and then bringing a queen into the game, white happily accepts and then brings a queen into the game. Of course, this is now completely winning for white. Magnus went for a quicker kill. He played rook captures on d5, and it was immediately in this position that Hikaru resigned the game on move 54. Because, you either trade and then there is nothing, or you try something, but there is nothing to be done here. For example, if you trade, you can get bishop captures on d5, king captures, and it seems like you will both get a queen. The problem is Magnus brings a queen in with check, and now Hikaru cannot bring a queen into the game. He has to play something, anything, and then you just play, whatever. Let's say queen a1, you take care of the queening square, and it's game over. So of course Hikaru knew this. After rook captures on d5, he resigned the game, and what a brilliant victory for Magnus Carlsen, taking down his biggest rival. But yeah, these are the preliminaries. I imagine both of them will qualify, and they will definitely get a chance to play each other one more time in this tournament, so we can expect some more grinding. But yeah, that's the game. I do hope you guys enjoyed it. Also hope you enjoyed the thumbnail. Really put a lot of thought into that one. I would like to thank Lorenzo Rossetti, Avery Brown, John Sved, Stephen Evers, and John Austin for contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of this wonderful tournament, checking up on your wonderful suggestions, and whatever else happens in the chess world. So thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.